All right, one more button. We're live.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Mhm.
All right, so welcome, folks. This is I lost count of now our outcome measures group meetings. But today we're set to do some cleanup work and some extended conversation about Pillar 4 issues that we didn't have time to address last meeting. And then we will go into Pillar 5 issues. And maybe sort of at the end, kind of now that we've hit all 5 pillars, unless somebody surprises us with a 6th pillar, we'll have to figure out where we're going next, which Emma will touch on at the end of the meeting. So Emma, do you want to share any updates that folks should be aware of?
Yes, just wanted to remind everyone that we are continuing to take notes in a shared document during these meetings, as we did last time with Pillar 4. So I will be sharing my screen during this meeting just to take notes live, and that will be accessible to everyone after the meeting if you have additional comments or anything that you would like to add to that shared notes document. So if there are things that you would like to typically put into the meeting chat, I would prefer to put into the meeting notes for afterwards, just to memorialize that. That could be just something to consider. But of course, you are more than welcome to put everything in chat if you would prefer to, and I can bring that over to the meeting notes as I did last time. And then secondly, we are continuing to add implementation considerations to a Google document as we go along and review the feedback from spreadsheets. I will say, I think that between the initial meeting on pillars 1 and 2, and now the feedback that we've been getting for pillars 3 and 4, there are fewer pieces of feedback that are related to the implementation of the blueprint. More of the feedback is very much related to the outcome measures. So we're having fewer and fewer things, but we did get 1 or 2 pieces of feedback this time that were related to implementation of the blueprint versus the outcome measures. But we are continuing to track that, and we'll bring that to the AIB as needed, and especially at the end when we're presenting the results of the work group and in time for the updated comprehensive plan. So I think that those are the updates as of right now.
Thank you. So before we get started on Pillar 4 stuff, does anyone have any questions or concerns that they need to bring up? Nope. All right, Emma, why don't you share in Pillar 4?
Oh, great. Okay, great. As I put into the agenda for today's meeting, I'm just gonna share my screen. Just give me a second here. We are, like other meetings, starting with, we don't have an update today from the CCR study or anything like that, so we're just gonna dive into the recap from the previous meeting. But we're gonna be sharing key takeaways for the Pillar 4 outcome measures from the previous meeting. Can you all see my screen? If you nod, okay, great, thank you. And then we are gonna then go into a review of the feedback that we've received so far for Pillar 5. Thank you to everyone who submitted feedback so far, and if you see things that weren't reflected in the presentation but that you would like to raise from your feedback today, please feel free. It doesn't have to be just limited to what's on the screen, but we did want to raise these things as pieces of feedback or additional outcome measures and revisions that we've seen so far for continued discussion. And then we will touch briefly on next steps. So first, I just wanted to highlight that we've received a considerable amount of additional feedback on and outstanding items, as we call it, on behavioral health interventions after the last meeting. So if you all recall, we had Lorianne and Mark from the Consortium on Coordinated Community Supports for our last meeting, and they provided a update and overview of how the grant process works, as well as some suggestions for outcome measures to measure the progress of the consortium and the effectiveness of behavioral health interventions. So we really appreciated that overview, and we had some additional feedback that came in either right before the meeting or right after the meeting, so we didn't get a chance to actually discuss that in the meeting. But I've collected that feedback from the spreadsheets and identified them here. So I just wanted to share that these were additional pieces of feedback focused on behavioral health interventions. I've sent this feedback to Mark and Lorianne, and we can ask them back at an additional meeting or an upcoming meeting on Pillar 4 when we revisit the Pillar 4 outcome measures to talk a little bit more about these specific measures or suggestions. But just wanted to identify the ones that have come in and we have not had a chance to talk about yet as a group. So those include effectively assessing outcomes of students receiving tier 2 and 3 behavioral health interventions. We did talk actually a lot about that last time at length. But other things include measuring the ability for students to access behavioral health services. In the feedback that we received, it was noted, that the ability for students to access versus actually ensuring that students do access those behavioral health services should be seen as two different things because they are two different things. The implementation of a behavioral health screener for all students or just students who demonstrate need. Whether measures should assess mental and social or emotional health in addition to behavioral health. In the comprehensive plan right now, I think we are using behavioral health to refer to both mental and social emotional health as well as behavioral health, using that term collectively, but that question was raised in the spreadsheet and maybe something we should revisit with a consortium specifically and get their feedback on. Another idea that was raised as a potential data source was using student self-reported data to measure the implementation of behavioral health services and their efficacy. And then defining what is meant by documented supports and services for students with behavioral health needs. That was another question and comment that was raised in the feedback that we received after last meeting. So again, I'm just highlighting this group here since there was a considerable amount of additional feedback, and this has been sent to the consortium.
Thanks, Emma. For those of you who have expertise in this area, would you care to share your thoughts on some of the, some of these bullets represent kind of choices to be made? Do you have thoughts that you'd like to share? Wait, go back.
Sorry, technical difficulties.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, Shamoya.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think it may just be worth mentioning that it would be important to have a behavioral health screener that is universal. That would align, I think, better with the MTSS multi-tiered systems of support for students if everyone is evaluated. If we say just students who demonstrate need, we leave ourselves open to subjective bias and an adult's perspective of what need might look like in a student.
So Shamoya, are you advocating then that we should have behavioral screeners for all students?
Yeah, I would essentially just strike or and everything after that in the third bullet.
Is that something that is a reasonable task to be undertaken within the school systems? Chelsea, do you have an answer to that question?
I don't have an answer. I guess when we talked through this at a local level, one of the concerns that we had is whether we would give parents the option to opt out of that. Usually when we get into the mental health, social emotional aspect, we have some parents that are asking for that kind of support. And then we have other parents that don't want you involved and who have denied counseling or other services that are provided by the school system. So there would have to be some type of barrier there, I guess, for families or parents that might refuse or opt out of a screener for mental health or behavioral health needs. So I wanted to mention that. I don't have an answer for how that would be done. However, I think it would be more about who it would be done by. So what we have heard from other counties as well is that that would really be taken on by the school nurse. And whether that is true or not has kind of been a discussion at the local level as to whether that would be done by a BCBA, whether a school nurse, whether a behavior coach, like what credentials would that individual have to administer the screener, or if it could be done in the classroom. From what we're hearing, it would be most appropriate to be done by a school nurse, and whether or not a school district would have the capacity to do that if it had to be done by a school nurse would be, I will speak for our county, challenging, as we're struggling to fill nursing positions, which from our directors meetings, that seems to be the case throughout the state. However, I'm not minimizing the importance of this because I feel that it's very, very important. I just feel that to manage that for every student in the county, in addition to knowing that we have some families that may refuse that, I just think it's something that this group needs to consider as well.
Dr. Addison?
Yeah, I would associate myself with the comments from Chelsea around that. Just thinking about the size of Montgomery County in terms of having over 162,000 students, right? That lift would be great. I think the other thing I would think about in terms of a universal health screener is the action afterward, right? So depending on the information that comes, right? Like we can't just leave, let's say we find something that would be troubling, right? So how do we would need to put something in place in that support piece so that after also is what I'm thinking about.
Queen?
Yeah, I just wanted to also echo Chelsea's point, but then to also ask, I guess in this case, Dr. Addison and Chelsea, to kind of get to what Chamoy is saying, because I agree it's something that would be advantageous, but capacity, workload, like who's going to do it is a big reach and task. What measures are in place right now in your districts, because you can't speak for everyone, for students and families to know about behavioral health services that are available? Like what does the world look like for like accessing behavioral health services right now for you all?
So I'll share a little bit. We usually start out with our tier process. So students that are identifying a need, we put in our tier 1, those supports intensify, tier 2, tier 3. That is one way that we kind of identify students that may show signs or, need additional support. We log that through our Power School system. So we can add counseling services through that. We can add behavioral services through that. We assign roles to who's going to support that. And that also runs through our SST, so our student support team. So it goes through that avenue as well. In addition, we work with our health department for local care team and really identify those needs as a partnership through the community. We also, if there is, a parent that, would submit something to us that they have concerns about, we address it through that. We also have what we call an aftercare meeting. So anytime a student's hospitalized for mental health or behavioral health needs, we have a meeting that includes our school support team that is involved in that to really identify why that student was hospitalized, what supports they need to re-enter the school, and so forth. So those are the ones that come to my head immediately. But those are some of the things that we currently have in place.
To follow up on that question, if a parent requested evaluation, would the student be evaluated?
Are you referring to like having like social emotional testing or anything like that?
I guess anything that like if a teacher said, I'm concerned about this child, could you evaluate him? Does the parent have that same access?
I mean, through our child find process, a parent or teacher can request assessments at any point in time. And yes, we have to adhere to that.
Sorry, can I do a
Shimoya?
follow-up? Because,
Oh,
sorry.
sure. Queen.
No, yeah, because
go
that's what I was getting at, Laura, and Chelsea, just like what advocacy do parents have in knowing what they can like have assessed of their child, kind of proactively, like versus reactively when the teacher or someone else says to, and then wondering if we can put a measure maybe around just that kind of data information from LEAs.
Yeah, and I want to kind of back up on that and clarify. Through the special education child find process, we can evaluate a student at any point in time. If a teacher has concerns, or if a parent has concerns, or maybe behaviors have increased, or we've seen indicators that are of concern, we can absolutely do an assessment. But just keep in mind that those are educational assessments, not medical evaluations. And I think there's a difference there that we need to discriminate. I mean, we can support families if they would request an outside evaluation, or if they would like a recommendation, like we support parents through that process as well. But normally when we look at those types of things, it's more of like a rating scale that the parent would rate, teacher would rate, and so forth.
Thank you. We'll go to Shimoya and then Joe.
Thanks. So it's been really helpful to hear about some of the concerns in implementing this. I just want to bring back to focus for us that the work we're doing here with the blueprint is transformational. So we're going to have to shift how it is that our schools operate. I'm going to put in the chat, and then it can be available to the public, a study by SAMHSA that cites some research from the University of Maryland that talks about how it is that these assessments can be administered. You don't need to have particular certifications. There are a myriad of processes that you can use student and family and community engagement to develop for what that universal assessment looks like. And as an example, it could be a grade level homeroom due now at the top of the day. Just asking students to write about themselves and how they feel. That is an example of a universal assessment. This goes hand in hand with what we want to see when it comes to school safety, when it comes to being proactive, the use of restorative practices, and the use of discipline in school. And so if we are intending to implement this the way that the blueprint truly envisioned it, we are going to have to universally evaluate our students. A multi-tiered system of support literally defines tier 1 as everybody. And so we can't opt out here. And I think there are a lot of ways, especially with the expansion of community schools and the work being done by the consortium, that we can come up with new ways that Maryland approaches the process to ensure that we can give all of our students what they require. Because like it or not, this is now a responsibility of our school systems.
Thank you, Shimoya. Thank you for the resource. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts going around my head, especially every time I hear Shimoya speak, I think it, causes me to, elevate additional questions. But, the one thing that has been like ringing in my mind is, in my experience, it seems like, as of right now, the bigger challenge isn't around identifying students, it's around providing the supports that are needed in order to help students that have already been identified. I mean, I think, really starting before going through and trying to unearth what other children have, behavioral or mental health concerns that need support. Like some of this is about really just shoring up the supports and interventions that we have for students that have already been identified, that are already in need. I think, the conversation around the lack of social workers across the state, for how many, how many students have struggles and need clinical supports is top of mind. So, I think even, perhaps prior to, or maybe adjacent to identifying additional students who have behavioral and mental health concerns is really, focusing on strengthening the network of supports that we have for students that have already been identified.
Actually, I'm gonna bring us to talk about another one of these bullets. One of them was using student self-reported data to measure implementation of behavioral health interventions and services. Do folks have thoughts? You know, we heard last week about like just finding out what resources or services were provided to various schools from the consortium folks, but what are the ups and downs, the advantages of using student self-report on receiving services? Shmoya?
I think it can only further legitimize the other data we'll already be collecting. It's a verification check. So not just did we do the thing, but how was it received?
Any other comments? Chelsea?
So we use like self-reporting assessments through like special education. I'm going back to what's natural to me. Like, for example, we have what's referred to as the BASC-3, which is the behavior assessment system for children. And that is an example of an assessment that a student can self-report behavioral needs using that. However, I kind of go back to my original point that that is a formal assessment that requires parent permission to administer. And so it's kind of determining what tool we're going to use. And, the example that was given earlier to me is, I agree, a tier 1 intervention that should be administered to all students, but that's kind of encompassed in our social emotional learning that we required all of our schools as it is. I guess when I think of a screener, I'm thinking more of a formal type of assessment that would be given by a certified individual. And I'm reading that incorrectly. So I think self-reporting is a great tool to use, but if we're identifying a specific tool, I think we just need to be sure that it's not a formal assessment that would require parent permission if we're not wanting to go in that direction.
Irene?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. So it sounds like there's a couple of different objectives that may be being intertwined. So it sounds like there is a need for every student to have a way to express whether or not they are feeling good about the environment that they're in. We need to assess their well-being. We need to assess whether or not they feel like they have the kind of support that they have someone that they can talk to if they're not feeling well. And we need to make sure that their overall sense of security, safety, and health and well-being is being taken care of. But then we're also talking about mental health and behavioral screening, which Chelsea mentioned may be something, different layers. So it sounds like there may need to be a tier type system where every student gets some kind of check-in, whether we call it a screener or call it, maybe a well-being survey. And then that information is used to determine whether or not they need a higher level of assessment. The second thing I wanted to mention is that as we think about self-report, and self-report can be very reliable, but it's only reliable when there's a proper amount of fidelity between the test taker and the one who's answering the questions. So if there are differences, especially differences between schools based on their demographics and the amount of support that the students feel in the environment, then we won't get the same reliability between different schools. So when this is implemented, there needs to be training and guidance on schools on creating a kind of environment that's conducive to students feeling like they have the support that they need in order to give reliable responses to those questions.
And Ivory, you just mentioned, you made me think of, I mean, that we still have, or Maryland still has I'm gonna say the wrong name of it, but just the school safety something climate survey. What's the name of it? Anybody?
It's just the Maryland School Survey right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Because so, I mean, that does tap into just the general school belonging climate space, I think. That might tap into some of what Ivory, you mentioned earlier about just kind of feeling supported to be in a safe learning environment. And that would be very different from, I think, the measures that would be used to assess mental health and behavioral health that we're referring to on here. But you're right that we need to make sure that those measures are implemented, administered the same way across schools. I was going to say something else and now I've lost my train of thought. I apologize. Are there other bullets on this slide number 3, that we should mention or think about while Joe is saying something? No.
Yeah, no, I'm also just, as we go through this conversation, just thinking through the challenge between, at a point in which everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority, right? And what we are asking LEAs and requiring LEAs to do versus what we're elevating as best practices, right? Because I think this is definitely something that, I think can be some process for daily check-ins with students on, their social emotional well-being, elevating that as a best practice, and also just being mindful that, like, if that is something that we as a group feel so strongly about, that we want to require that of all the LEAs, just to be mindful about like what that means about what that means in terms of the time and energy that that it takes at a school level or at a district level in order to manifest that particular policy, and also what that means in terms of potentially de-emphasizing other aspects of the blueprint.
Thank you, Joe. Keeping us at the right level, thinking about things. Although what you're just made me think of was the customer service button. You know how you walk in places and there's a thing where you can hit green, yellow, or red in terms of how you're feeling about your customer service you received? That may be a solution. I'm just kidding, but that's something along those lines. All right, Emma, do you want to take us to the next? And things are still open for, as you're thinking about these things, you can add to Emma's document here. But if you take us to slide 4 to talk about more family issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for your patience with us. As we were talking, I was like, I really should be taking notes on screen because this is a really good conversation. So thanks for that. Okay. So for the other points, a lot of these will be familiar because we talked about them last time. But these are just things that we have not resolved that, I don't know if you could ever fully say that they're going to, some of these will be fully resolved, but that we need to have continued discussion on, meaning the developing relevant outcome measures for each of the work groups recommendations for ELLs identified in the Blueprint Comprehensive Plan. This was a comment that was noted in the feedback, rather than just having that, these will be implemented. It's what will the outcome measures be for ensuring their successful implementation, which is a very good point. Then we also looked at or started to discuss, but didn't finish talking about appropriate measures that reflect the activity of a community school. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that last time, but I think there's still need for further discussion and consideration for some of these things. We talked a little bit about outreach and engagement strategies, attendance, both things in the short and the long term in terms of measuring community school implementation and effectiveness, and had a really rigorous discussion on that, which was also captured in the meeting notes. Another outstanding item was tracking and measuring the types of mental health professionals hired by community schools. I think that this was something that was identified in a piece of feedback that was received after the meeting, but was a good question. Is this something that we should be tracking to measure community school implementation and effectiveness? And if we should, I think that this would warrant further research and discussion. And then also a few people brought this up, the comparison group for student groups identified in the pillar level outcome measures. Specifically, we were looking at meeting the college and career readiness standards for students who are receiving special education services, students from low-income households, EL students. So some of the questions that came up in the feedback were, well, what's the comparison group, ensuring that that's identified? And I think, that's part of also a broader conversation around the fact that the outcome measures for this pillar level are in some ways a disaggregation of the pillar level outcomes for pillar 3, which look at college and career readiness for all students, but we're disaggregating by student groups, of course, and that includes, the student groups that are identified in pillar 4. So that would be, continued area for discussion and some part of the outstanding items from last meeting.
Thank you, Emma. So if I understand your last comment about this last bullet, are you saying that if we appropriately measure pillar 3 outcomes disaggregated by the groups that we're supposed to generally disaggregate by, that we would have answered this question about pillar 4 anyway?
I think so. I think that that's where we're getting at, because this is going to be, because reaching the college and career readiness standard is something that we're measuring across all of the identified student groups, at least that we've identified so far. Of course, that list can continue to evolve, but I think that most of the student groups identified in this pillar, if not all of them, I'm pretty sure it's actually all of them, are part of the groups that we're disaggregating for across the board. So I think that that's where we're getting at with this, but obviously, that might need some further discussion to confirm.
Thank you. Does anybody feel strongly about wanting to discuss any of these bullets before I follow up with specific questions about these bullets? All right, so we had talked at some length about sort of reflecting what would signify an active, good community school. We talked about parent engagement and what we need to appropriately measure that. Attendance, I think, is something that is often measured, as often actually hailed as a success of community schools, is that they often result in higher attendance rates. So I think attendance is an easy one there. But what about student mobility? Looking at student mobility, would that be a reflection of a quality or low quality community school? Keisha?
Yeah, I'm on the fence about that one, only because sometimes families need to move, right? Is just that they need to move, just there might be circumstances, and it really isn't an indication of the extent to which the community school supports them. They might actually have supported them to finding a more affordable place. So I would be, I'm nervous about that mobility. And when I think about it from our district, we look at mobility not only, within county, because you have students who move within county and go to different schools, but they also might move across county, right? They might leave us and then they might come back. So, and again, that might not be something that, there is any control over. So I'm not really, I don't put a lot into that one.
Joe and then Jenny.
I think I originally surfaced that as a metric, and it's primarily because that, some of this is what the research that was done by Burke and Baltimore found, that that effective community schools, over time, the transient rate amongst students were diminished, and clearly, as Dr. Addison says, there is some expected mobility, especially for many families that are in schools with high concentrations of poverty. But the studies that were done by Burke and Baltimore showed that over time, because of the level of support, presumably because of the level of support that they were getting from the community school, and then also the additional wraparound services that parents found there to be high value of remaining at that school, and continuing to be connected to the supports that were provided. So I think just that's what the research has surfaced in the past. I don't know if that's something that will continue, and I think clearly that diminishes over time as all of our schools become community schools, and you can't you wouldn't be able to distinguish between similar schools, that one that's implementing the strategy and others that are not.
Thank you. Jenny?
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what Dr. Addison said. I think we have a lot of mobility. I think, Joe, what you mentioned about the Burke study, one, I think was done, as you just said, at a time when there was a smaller subset of community schools compared to the overall number of schools in the district. We are basically now, all of our schools are going to be community schools. So I don't know, how you differentiate then mobility based on kind of families just needing to move versus whether or not it's because or attributed to a school being able to provide, the support. So I would have some questions about using mobility as a measure here, because I think it will be hard to distinguish, what you're actually attributing the mobility to. And like we said, basically, essentially all of Baltimore schools are going to be community schools. So I think in the past it was different, right? So I don't know that it's going to carry forward.
Thank you. Shmoya?
This is a really difficult question. I think there's some value in assessing student transiency, but there are all these individual needs assessment that speak to the specific barriers that get in the way of students' academic success. And I wonder if it's not possible for us to create a framework that allows community schools to utilize the results of their needs assessments. Because if you have a community of folks like maybe in Washington County who don't move around very much, but they still have a community school and their issue is not transiency, they should be able to, I think the results of their needs and assets assessment should help us determine what the most appropriate metrics for evaluation is. And I know that's not the right answer for this group and what we're trying to do.
I am not, I don't feel wedded to an idea that we have to have the same measure for every single thing. I kind of like the idea of having appropriate measures per context. Just as we talked earlier, I think it was in pillar 1, but when the topic came up of KRA at the end of the year, what are schools doing now? What measures are they already using? And maybe that's appropriate to have different measures across different schools. I'm not saying that that's what we'll do, but I think that's an intriguing thing. If schools are, each school creates measures that they hold themselves accountable to, depending on what their needs assessment was.
And there might be broad categories that are similar that would help make it easier to aggregate, but yeah.
I mean, this probably fits just more in the outputs as opposed to outcomes category, but we haven't even mentioned just having the completed needs assessment as being and output, right? I mean, I think that's something that, you know, should be an expectation and that we should be tracking, you know, you know, all the community schools have completed a needs assessment and have used that to surface particular assets within the community and needs within the community, and use that to structure steps forward and goals.
Mm-hmm. And then we look at the percentage of schools who meet goals as specified. It's a very hands-on approach that, and we'll say it was Shamoya's idea. All right, more on this page, this slide. Developing relevant outcome measures for each of the ELL work groups recommendations identified in the blueprint, comprehensive blueprint plan. I'm trying to remember 2 weeks ago about what the conversation, I don't know if Emma, if you have off the top of your head what some of those were that.
Yeah, I think that the note was that we identified outcome measures that really were things that could be addressed through the comprehensive plan and wouldn't have to be addressed through a change in legislation. And, you know, were things that could be just simply adopted within the comprehensive plan, and they were identified in the comprehensive plan. So I think the suggestion was that rather than having an outcome measure that simply says, were these implemented, it would be individualized outcome measures for each of those for each of those recommendations from the work group that were integrated into the comprehensive plan. So I think that would require building out potentially quite a few more outcome measures, but it's something that we could revisit when we discuss Pillar 4 again.
Okay, we should do that.
Yeah.
Speaking of additional outcome measures, if you go one more slide.
Yes, we have some additional ones.
About 15 minutes, a little less than 2. So these were, well, I'll let you walk through them.
Yeah, definitely. These are ones, let me see. Most of these were actually from the last meeting. I think almost all of these were. I think the only one that was added as a result of additional feedback was measuring whether EL students who receive special education services and students from low income households receive the resources and supports they need. And the others here, again, they were from the previous meeting, so I won't go through and name all of these. Obviously, these are not fully fleshed out. A lot of these were ideas that were raised in the feedback forms. So, you know, if you would like to speak to some of these ideas or suggestions, or if you actually have fully fleshed out outcome measures and statements that, you know, speak to more than just these ideas, but are actually outcome measures that we could potentially integrate into the Pillar 4 right now. Of course, you don't have to raise them now, but if you have them at some point, we would love to get those suggestions. But we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about these additional outcome measures in the last meeting. We spent a significant amount of time talking about behavioral health interventions, talking about the community school implementation. So we just wanted to revisit these. And if there's any that someone would like to raise or has some suggestions about, I have a few that I would like to know a little bit more about if somebody would like to speak to them, but I'll open up the floor a little bit here first before we ask those questions.
I think you should ask your questions, Emma.
Okay, sounds good. So, you know, I think we had, again, some suggestions here that we just weren't sure if somebody had an example and would like to go into this a little bit more. I would love to hear a little bit more about measuring access in terms of, or measuring access to supports for EL students, for students who receive special education services and students from low-income households to receive the support, resources and supports they need. What does that look like? What would an example outcome measure for that in terms of access versus, you know, do they actually get those supports? If anybody has any thoughts on that. or a concrete example of what that would look like. Another one was a measure that disincentivizes SPED funding, special education funding supplementation. That was something that was raised in a feedback form, and would like to hear a little bit more about that, and what that actually looks like. And then I think we also had some suggestions around resources, language accessibility. What would that look like? Would that be the number of languages translated in particular documents? Would it be ensuring that all communications meet the top 5 reported languages in a particular LEA, that they are all translated into those languages? Again, we'd just like to get some examples of how we could operationalize some of these, or what the constructs potentially would be. So if anybody has any thoughts on those, or would like to, further explain what they meant by some of these suggestions, that would be great. But if not, we can move on to pillar 5. Yes, Chelsea.
So I did not put the top one on my feedback form, but I just want to make a comment about it, because students who receive special education services, that is a legal document. So if they're not getting the resources and supports they need, and that's an issue. I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a measure in place for that, and it's the IEP, unless whoever put this meant something different. But for special education specifically, I think that, I'll say, stopgap is already in place through the IEP process. If a student is not getting the services or supports that they need through the IEP that are already outlined on the IEP, then obviously that goes into a legal issue as far as not receiving those supports and services.
Okay, thank you for raising that, Chelsea. I don't know if anybody who suggested that had some thoughts about what they meant, or maybe were unaware that that was something that was already in place, but that is good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say we got some feedback. Strong Schools Maryland hosts workshops separately so that members of the public can also help us weigh in and set these metrics. And like, there is how things are supposed to be done on paper, and then there's how policy actually gets done or doesn't get done. And we work with a lot of special education advocates who have told us about the issues that they and their clients are experiencing and receiving whatever it is that their IEPs may require, especially still dealing with like the ongoing pandemic and its consequences, things related to the digital divide, whether learning time and services that were supposed to be provided wherever retroactively provided, that kind of thing. And so I think like there's an overarching theme here that can probably be addressed by, I think it was like the 4th to last bullet on the slide. But the question is like, are we really looking at things like the ratios of folks we're providing, ensuring that all those things are actually provided, because that is a better measure than like legally we have to do it.
No, I understand. I appreciate the context there, because it does, I understand that better. I would just recommend, and I understand the advocacy side of that as well from a parent, that if there are things in the IEP that are not being implemented, they have every right as a parent to be very concerned about that. And that's something they should address with the local level as far as the director. And there's that whole mediation process and state complaint process that we have available for parents as well. But that document, even though it is just on paper, that is a legal document. So, if it's not being implemented, then that's a concern. I guess for the work group purpose, I feel that there is a measure in place as what students should be receiving, at least through the IEP process. Now, if it's not being followed, like I said, that kind of goes down a different avenue.
Chelsea, I'm thinking about this from like a school administrator perspective, and I'm trying to think about reviewing IEP documents that go out quarterly. I feel like related service providers are tracked a little bit more so, how many sessions were required, how many sessions were implemented, and then that could be tracked through a compensatory learning process. I'm thinking more about the general ed services that sometimes I believe they're usually listed as number of sessions per week or month, or there's flexibility in that. But do we have a good tracking measure, a way to take it from the IEP for somebody on the outside to say, yes, my child got the right number of whichever reading, math sessions that were required? Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like speech is usually like, I saw your child X number of sessions and here's the progress they made, but I'm not sure that it's tabulated in a way that would report it. And honestly, I'm thinking about our families who may not necessarily be as involved or who are cowed by the special ed process because it's intense. The paperwork's intense. Like, how do we as a system advocate for those students who don't get those sessions or supports? I'm wondering if there's data around that would track it.
And for those folks who are wondering who this voice is from beyond, that was Rachel Amstutz of the AIB staff.
Yes. Sorry, I'm running the magic of the stream and the Zoom today, but yes, Rachel Amstutz, Director of Operations and Policy at the AIB.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And you're absolutely correct that OT, PT, behavior, speech, any related service pretty much is logged. Now, I don't want to speak for the whole state because not all counties use the Maryland Online IEP system, but for Garrett County specifically, we require all of our related service providers to log those services in the IEP. After the pandemic, we went through and we had a determination meeting for every single student in our county as to whether they would require compensatory education. MSDE had us submit that data quarterly to them. So we were internally monitoring what students required compensatory services coming out of the pandemic. And the expectation was that those would we would have the determination meeting within a year and those would be made up. I'm not sure what the state data looks like as of right now, but for Garrett County specifically, all of those compensatory services have been made up to students. We have logs of all of those services, and we required our special education teachers to log all of those services during the pandemic. Now, post pandemic and post compensatory service, after all that's been recovered, and I'm going to say this too, like every county does this differently. There are some counties that require their special education teachers to log those reading math services. There are other counties that have not done that because they are afraid that we would have a mass exodus of special education teachers because the paperwork is already very time consuming in special ed, and to require them to log all the services they're providing, we could get some pretty significant pushback on that from the special ed teacher side of that. What we rely on is we require our special education teachers to submit their schedule to us, that we can cross-reference the IEP services for reading and math with their schedule to ensure that those students are receiving those services. We also require them to provide a schedule in which they're meeting with instructional IAs or temporary contracts or any additional support individuals that would be working with students to show that there has been collaboration and there has been, training provided for those individuals. So I do see your point with the reading and math services. And as of now, I will say, I don't want to say all, but a majority of the counties do not require special ed teachers to log the reading and math services, but related services is pretty much across the board. We require them to log that. Does that answer what you wanted?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Chelsea. And Rachel.
There was a couple other suggested outcome measures that we haven't talked about that I was curious about. If anybody wants to chime in and say that they had written it or they think they know what the person meant. But one of them was the real earnings of students served by community schools. What is the goal there? What's the connection between the earnings and the schooling? And also GIS is a tool to monitor teacher movements between schools. Wanted to learn more about those two suggestions. Okay. Yep, Ivory.
Yeah, I didn't suggest either of them, but I know with earnings, that can be very that can be a very contentious measure because students who come from more affluent families, they tend to earn more because of their family connections and network. And so the amount that they earn, I would say it should not be indicative, or we shouldn't consider that indicative of how good the school is performing.
Thank you. Tim?
I was just also going to mention that it's probably not a timely manner, since many of our community schools are probably established at elementary pockets of poverty or neighborhood poverty. And so Blueprint will be determined whether it's successful or not by the time we actually get to the finish line for some of these, for a measure like that. And so it may not be timely.
Megan?
Hi, yeah, so I did put in the GIS as a tool to monitor teacher movement, especially since we're going to be incentivizing them to go into our more needed schools. And it's a very rich tool. So we're going to be monitoring those teacher movements anyway. So if we load that data, we would also be able to see not only within the school system, but between school systems and where that movement's taken place and what we can do to help combat some of that, or at least make sure some of our teachers are able to move a little differently. And we've never done it before, but it would be a great way to monitor that.
So as I'm thinking about movement and sort of a network graph. But would that be considered a good thing or a not so good thing of teacher movement?
I think it's going to be more transparent, so we can take a look at and see the net gain, net losses, and movement across the map, and the GIS would allow you to do that.
And is this relevant for all schools, or is it just the community schools?
I mean, you could focus in on the community schools for this particular metric because we are incentivizing those teachers to move to those schools, right? So for me, that's where you would start and pilot this as a tool.
And GIS is Geographical Information System?
Correct.
Thanks, Shamar. Michael? You're on mute.
I wanted to comment on the idea of tracking earnings for students in community schools. The simple point is their earnings are going to depend on a lot more proximate things than what community school they were in. It's going to matter where they went to post-secondary, what they majored in, and what career field they're in. That's a pretty complicated set of steps to monitor, I think.
Thank you. Any other comments? And I'm about to have a coughing fit, so Emma, go.
Shamoya?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that the point about language accessibility in all LEA communications is not intended to put like more work on LEAs to then figure out how to translate things. I think the state should be providing that resource since it has an understanding of like the distribution of various other language speakers across our schools. So it should be an added support to LEAs.
I think that sort of goes to not necessarily an outcome measure issue, but a implementation issue.
Definitely.
So centralization.
All right, any other points before we move on to our Pillar 5 discussion? Like we said, if you have any suggestions for how to actually create an outcome measure based off of these ideas, even if it's one that you did not originally propose, please feel free to add it to this document, to email it to us, whatever works for you. We would definitely like to get those suggestions, so that would be very, very helpful. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to just quickly talk about the Pillar 5 outcome measures themselves that the work group reviewed before we dig into the actual feedback. So, okay. So first, just wanted to note that thank you all for your patience with getting the outcome measures this week. And we did get a significant number of questions, as well as general feedback and comments on the outcome measures that we've received so far. And then we have a few revisions and additional outcome measures, but you know, from today's conversation, we may have some more. So we're looking forward to having that and having those ideas proposed. A lot of the questions that were raised were around how will these things be measured? What data sources could be used? Are you considering these types of these considerations for how you will measure this feasibly, accurately, reliably? So those are questions that, again, are in this work group document, that are this spreadsheet that we sent out to everyone before the meeting, but they will also be sent to the ex officio team to discuss further, because a lot of those, I think, are around what data is available and how is this currently being measured, or how is this potentially being tracked already. So, you know, we can definitely talk about some of these things today, and we will dig into those a little bit further as well with the ex officio team. So I'll just again go through the Pillar 5 outcome measures that we have so far. And we have consolidated and streamlined, again, these outcome measures as we've done with all the others. So these pillar level outcome is really looking at what the blueprint is anticipated to do overall. And so, you know, not a big expected outcome at all, and by any means. But as you all know, that the blueprint is fully implemented with fidelity and successful in achieving the blueprint's goal that all students can leave high school globally competitive and prepared for success in post-secondary education and training, work, and life. The outcome measures that we have with that, since this Pillar 5 is focused on accountability and implementation of the accountability and governance of the blueprint's implementation, looks at public awareness in the blueprint's mission to transform Maryland's education system, the number of collaborative relationships between the AIB and state and local entities responsible for implementing the blueprint, the identification of innovative practices that are successful in improving student outcomes at the school level, Maryland's scores on PISA, the international assessment that is part of the Pillar 5 goal to actually have Maryland participate in PISA. So that's, I think, objective 3 in Pillar 5, as well as allocation of per student funding by LEAs and how state and local funds are used by LEAs to implement the policies and practices that are outlined in the blueprint. We also have a number of outcome measures that are associated with supporting blueprint implementation planning. Those include incorporating public feedback. What we're doing even now, this is public feedback, this is public engagement around the blueprint and the blueprint comprehensive planning. And, you know, as we know, the outcome measures are going to be part of the updated blueprint comprehensive plan and future iterations of that. We are also looking at the local education agency plans and state education agency plans and how they are aligned with the blueprint, in addition to the AIB's approval of state and local agency plans. These are all outcome measures that are associated with supporting blueprint implementation planning. In addition to, this is very important, the technical assistance that's provided to state and local agencies in actually implementing their blueprint plans. The second objective is around establishing and deploying expert review teams. These are teams of experts, as you can imagine, but because it says expert review teams that are deployed by the State Department of Education to visit schools across the state. All schools will be visited. I think the goal is by fiscal year 2032, I think, maybe 2030, well, one of the two. But those evidence-based recommendations from the expert review teams will be part of, and their findings are part of what we look at when the AIB is, or what the AIB looks at when approving implementation plans. But part of the success of that is actually identifying and disseminating the best practices from the expert review team. So we have several outcome measures focused on that. Outcome measure for objective 3 is very simple. We have this at the pillar level is Maryland students' performance on PISA, but the outcome measure, which is really just a yes or no, is Maryland participating in PISA, is coordinating Maryland's participation in PISA. So that's the outcome measure for objective 3. And I'm not sure what happened here with objective 4. I think that this is monitoring blueprint implementation, or it should be. I think it was accidentally deleted in the version that I have, so I apologize. But the outcome measure that we have here is around the release of funds by the AIB based on whether LEA plans are being implemented successfully and achieving the expected outcomes. So I just talked a lot, but I'm just going to share a few of the revisions and suggested additional measures that have come up so far, and we can dig into these further, and we'll take notes as we did last time. So some of the suggested revisions to the measures include consolidating the objective 1 measures to just a couple of measures indicating AIB approval of state and LEA plans and the amount of time or money spent in addressing technical assistance needs. And then some of the additional outcome measures were really around the pillar level outcome measures, looking at more global outcome measures. And these are definitely long-term outcome measures around high school graduation rates of Maryland high school graduates and who are enrolled in an institution of higher education, that they're employed in the career field of their choice, incarceration rates in the Maryland population, and poverty rates as well. So those were some of the additional ones that were suggested in the shared feedback form that you all received. Of course, we can talk about other ones that were not identified in that form today if you didn't get a chance to provide feedback. But yes, so I think that this provides a good framework for this conversation.
Thank you, Emma.
Yeah.
So I see pillar 5 as sort of the meta pillar, that it's just making sure, trying to put in mechanisms by which we make sure all the other stuff is supposed to happen. So really, this is your opportunity. We've been focused a lot on LEAs and what they have to put. This is your opportunity to specify what the AIB should be doing, or what in some cases MSDE should be doing when it comes to expert review teams. So one of the comments was, or questions was, with regard to the overall objective, is how do we measure, one of the draft outcome measures was measuring public awareness of what the blueprint is supposed to be doing, and that the AIB, the board and the staff of the AIB see that as one of our major goals, is to make sure that everybody knows what we're supposed to be doing. So how do we measure that? And again, I'm going to mute myself.
Shamoya?
Yeah, I think the legislation, or was it House Bill 1372 in 2021, says that AIB has a responsibility to communicate with and educate the public on things related to the implementation of the blueprint. So I think we can start with like those output measures, what has actually been done. And then I think it's worth digging into that question of like how the AIB has actually educated people. It could be assessed via polling after a certain amount of time, but I just want to be clear, I don't know that it's mentioned elsewhere that there's a specific charge to communicate with and educate the public.
Right. I think that I think it's in pillar 1, right? Or in the overall objective. I think that is part of what it's trying to get at here, but are you thinking putting this in another objective, or keeping this as a pillar level outcome measure, Shamoya?
So I will say that I'm not certain right now. I do think that like it does make sense as an outcome measure, but I don't know like whether that's a direct link to the AIB's work educating the public, or is it that like they happen to be a member of MSCA and they're always getting emails about it, or they're signed up through Strong Schools. Like, how do we know that the AIB's efforts yielded XYZ thing? I think like the communication with and the engagement is absolutely evidenced by things like this meeting and then the summer plan development meetings. But like, has the AIB educated the public? Have folks seen Chair Leggett? Do they know who the AIB is? That kind of thing.
Okay, so it sounds like your suggestion is that some of the, maybe there's some targets that are specific to the AIB around this, like in terms of number of public engagement events or something along those lines when we get back down to that point. But that could be the AIB in addition to maybe other entities as well, but the AIB should be part of that. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
So that was one of my comments that I had, is whether there's going to be budget for AIB to actively or passively be looking at the metric in order to understand public understanding of what's happening. So is that survey sampling that takes budget, that takes time, that takes a research team, or the passive where they're always getting public comment and feedback, which we've been doing already. So it could be both, but that's something to think about as a metric to really know and understand what the other stakeholders beyond the walls of the educators' buildings are thinking and knowing about what's happening as we continue to measure out year after year.
I agree.
Yeah, I think we had a conversation before with another pillar about inputs versus outputs. And it seems like most of these are outputs, but will we have the opportunity to look at things like whether or not every high school has a full slate of math and science? Because there's a lot of schools that don't have physics and calculus. And so if a school doesn't, and of course, there's a lot of disproportionality related to the schools that have the highest percentage of Black and Brown students, and the likelihood that they will not have calculus or physics in the high school. And the same is true with teachers with more experience being in, or less teachers with experience in these schools. So should that be included here, or is there another way to discuss those types of issues?
That might be a pillar 3 issue, the high quality instructional materials. And I'm looking at Rachel Heiss right now in my little windows here.
I'm nodding my head. Yes, I think particularly around English and math and offering the full curriculum at every high school. I think that would definitely fall into pillar 3. Although I like how you're thinking. I'm trying to think of like along the lines of you, like how Dr. Tolson, what you're suggesting, like those kinds of measures that might make sense to be in pillar 5. So that's a good thought exercise.
Yeah, because if we're looking at where they're going after high school, the types of classes that they have offered in high school, it has a lot to do with that. There are some public high schools that don't have certain classes that you would need to get into some of the more competitive colleges or universities in the state.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I may be missing what's going on here, or at least have a different cut at it. But when I think about what would the public need to know about the AIB, first, I'm not sure they really need to know a whole lot. I think what they need to know more about is in ways that the public can understand, is Maryland's education system getting better? Right. And you could imagine a couple of ways of approaching that. One would be what we just talked about, is every school in the state, the kids in every school in the state have the opportunity to take the courses that could open the doors of opportunity for them. my guess is if we could figure out how to measure that, which I think is not that difficult, right? People would care about that. People would take notice of that. If you surveyed recent high school graduates and said, now that you're in the real world, how well prepared are you for the college you're in or the job that you're in, right? Do you have the academic skills or other skills that are necessary to succeed in that? You could ask the same question for employers. You could ask the same question of college faculty. Basically ask the question, are the kids better prepared now than they used to be? Or at least are they as well prepared as they need to be now that they're out of high school? I think you could get public attention on that pretty easily, and you'd have the kind of public conversation about the quality and condition of the system that I think could be a healthy one. So I'd worry less about the public understanding what the AIB is doing and more about the public's understanding of whether kids are well prepared, better prepared, and the schools are doing a better job in fairly simple and straightforward ways.
So Mike, I really like the examples you provided. I guess a non-example of like, it would be less significant for somebody to say, well, I know all 5 pillars of the blueprint, like as a measure of public engagement and awareness with the blueprint. It's more, I
Right.
understand how the blueprint, or even just how the education system, without being able to, bring it back to the blueprint. Of course, we hope that they would, but that we understand how the education system is changing in Maryland, and how it's transforming over the next 10 years. That's what, so I guess I'm just trying to provide an example of what would be a good thing to hope for in terms of engagement and awareness.
Again, that's sort of what I was trying, what I'm
Right.
trying to sort of frame, and part of it has to do with the outcomes for kids, right? And the system and the places they wind up and how well prepared they are for that. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there's got to be a way to frame questions. Basically, have to do with improving the supply of highly qualified teachers. There's got to be some publicly understood notions about that you could turn into surveys that would give you a pretty good reading as to whether at least some parts of the public understand that the more well-prepared, more effective teaching force than there had been, or something along those lines. And you'd certainly want to do that for with respect to the least well-served communities, right? That's got to be a particular focus.
Chelsea?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of go from I agree that that is very important. And I think that as we implement Blueprint, that data and those outcome measures are going to be very helpful in getting our community more engaged. I think from the perspective of right now, I mean, I guess my thought process is going more towards what are we pushing out to families? What attempts are we making to have them engaged? And, speaking specifically to Garrett County, one of the things that we did was we had it on every CCAC agenda, which is our Special Ed Citizens Advisory. We had it on our Title I agendas. We pushed out one pagers, we called them, for each pillar. We did a video on each pillar with the pillar leads on information about that and pushed it out to community. We had a community meeting night. We did press releases. We did a radio talk. So we did all of these things to push out information about the blueprint and the corresponding information to our community and our families as much as possible. To me, I feel like from a local accountability level, we are doing a lot to get our families engaged, to get our community engaged. We want to keep that conversation going, and that's something we're going to have to continue to implement as we continue to implement these the outcomes that are in the blueprint and how we're doing that, and also sharing the data with them as how that is looking in our county. What are we doing? Are we seeing growth in that? Are we not seeing growth in that? So I guess that's why I get a little leery about pulling the community about their understanding of it, because I think that's going to there's a lot of factors that are going to impact those results. But I feel like from a local level, ensuring that we are pushing information out to our communities, that we are being transparent with the data is more important from our lens to making sure that they are informed and educated about what the standards are for us at the local level.
Michael, is your hand up again, or is
Oh,
your?
no,
Okay, all right,
no, it was still up unintentionally.
okay, thank you. I want to go down to objective 1, which is really about support blueprint implementation planning. And most of these objective draft of outcome measures were about the review of the LEA and MSDE plans, the provision of technical support. And one of the questions was, how will alignment be measured? And alignment was about alignment of local education agencies' implementation plans with the blueprint comprehensive implementation plan. And I wanted to ask the AIB staff who are currently reviewing some of the LEA plans to just talk a little bit about that process, and everybody have their thinking caps on about like, how can we measure to hold the AIB accountable for doing what needs to be done? So Rachel Heiss,
Yes.
turning it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so as you said, we have been reading all of the LEA blueprint implementation plans. And right now in this initial plan, what the LEAs have submitted is responses to a series of questions that were designed or developed by MSDE and AIB staff ultimately to kind of elicit sort of in the initial plans, sort of the baseline information around the various requirements of the blueprint and plans to do the things that are required in the blueprint. And so those are arranged in pillars 1 through 5. And there are criteria for success that were also developed by MSDE and AIB that are being used to judge whether the response is acceptable or sufficient. And so there is alignment between the comprehensive plan and review of the LEA implementation plans. But I think in the future, there could be even greater alignment, I will just say. And I think that's something that we, in reviewing the plans this year, we've realized, we've recognized places where, we need to be better aligned. And so I think it is going to be a improvement process, but I do think the process of the annual process of reviewing plans and approving them, or once we get out of the actual writing of the plans, the actual progress in implementing or progress in doing what you said you would do in your plan will be able to use that as a measure. I think where the challenge is, ultimately, and the law says this, LEAs will continue to revise their plans until they're approvable. So, ultimately it should be 100%, unless there is, there could be times when, LEAs are not revising their plans in the time frame that's provided, where a plan ultimately does have to be disapproved. But the hope is that is very few and far between. So I'm not sure how valuable that would be as a measure, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It definitely isn't, input, but I don't know that it's an outcome measure. Does anyone have any other AIB staff or Mike, you're also reviewing the plans if you have any other thoughts on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Now I need to come up with some thoughts.
No, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I was just
No, I've been thinking it's a reasonable question,
yeah.
right? And I will tell you, it was, when I was reviewing those that I was responsible for, sometimes it was a sort of tough judgment call as to how aligned, did they really tell me what I think they were supposed to tell me, or what I should be looking for in order to right, to say they met the expectation. And that's inherent, I think, in the nature of this work. But I do think that once you've gotten to a point where you've basically said to districts, I think you're on the right track now overall, right? Then the question is not could they keep revising their plans as much as how well are they doing what they said they would do? And is it producing the behavior of the kids or the teachers or whoever in the school district? Is it actually producing the steps that you intended it to? And if not, what are you going to do about it? I think you need a way to structure that kind of dialogue, which is somewhere between compliance monitoring and recognizing that this is really complicated work, and people in every district need an opportunity to talk through how they're doing this and what they're figuring out, what adjustments they need to make in a slightly less than purely compliance monitoring context. Easier said than done.
And in some ways it goes back to the outcome measure, the outcomes that are expected and the steps to get to the outcomes and whether
Right.
the steps are being followed, which is a little bit compliancy.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I apologize for missing some of the conversation. This also speaks to the implementation technical assistance that the AIB is to provide access to or provide funding for. And so the measures around that, I think, are going to be tricky, but need to be created. Is the AIB doing what it needs to do to support the LEAs?
Mhm.
So any ideas on how we measure that?
Well, one thing, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. One thing is we're literally asking the LEAs what technical assistance support they think they need and what would be helpful to them. And then we're going to use that information obviously to inform the technical assistance that we provide. We're also asking the reviewers of the LEA plans based on what they read across multiple plans, where do they think the LEAs need technical assistance, because sometimes they might think they're perfectly on point and a little off base, and particularly if there's a pattern across LEAs with particular parts of the blueprint, that's where we would want to provide technical assistance as well. And if I could just add, also not just AIB providing technical assistance, although we are charged with that, but also MSDE.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
the
what
CTE
would you
committee and the
see?
consortium, and yeah.
So what could we see that would let you know, oh yeah, they're doing their job? So for those of you who are from LEAs, what could you read or see that would say, okay, yeah, they are supporting us, what we need?
a great question. I would love some ideas.
I don't think that's an easy question to answer. So, I mean, I think of like, it's kind of like you're trying to professionally develop us on parts of the plan, and provide feedback similar to the way that we would seek feedback on our instruction or professional development for staff. So some of that could be part of what I think is gathered, but I think the real gap is that when a technical assistance happens and we provide feedback, that's one thing. But the places where we don't have any, there's a void of technical assistance. There almost needs to be a yearly or some type of survey related to the needs of districts and having some type of like feedback around that. But it's not just like technical assistance. It's also the pieces that you were talking about with communication and making sure that we're able to connect with clear expectations to like our funding authorities and clear expectations with like what we're writing into our plans, because those pieces are also fundamentally undermining like the work as far as like how we're developing our plans and how we're developing our steps moving forward, because there's a lot of places where we're all kind of a work in progress, and without some of the clarity is the problem, because without the clarity, we're continuing to kind of implement and feel like we're kind of going down pathways that may or may not be successful, but also we are kind of misrepresenting in some cases the intent or like the things that we might have to do. And I think that we continue to have that kind of struggle back and forth. So it's not only the clarity that is needed within the technical assistance sessions, but it's like the formalized documents that have to come out of some of these places where we're receiving a lot of informal guidance that then can have major budgetary implications that are then coming back on us as school systems to then try to implement. So that's part of like the technical assistance trainings that I would like, we need to kind of connect that back to like, then what's funded and then what's actually possible within some of these plans. And I think that this first plan is kind of the bad representation, because you need a time machine to fix some of the things that were done. And so we've submitted the budgets for 24, not going well, but the fiscal 22 and 23, there's like, those are done like that. So like when we're writing the narrative there, it's like, if you wanted us to do something different with the money, we didn't know. And so, we're going back in time to try to figure that out narrative wise, but it's not really a change in practice. It's a change in narrative. And so as we move forward, 25 to 27's plan, that's the exciting plan, and where we really have to then outline some pieces. And then what's the yearly check-in? What's the technical assistance that's in making sure that we're actually on that implementation track? Because without that, we're going to have a hard time with our funding authorities maintaining the funding if we don't feel like there's a pressure point in like due dates, milestones, et cetera, that are going to be part of those plans. And that's where like we're not quite connected yet in that space to make all that make sense.
Thank you, Tim. Jenny?
I think I'll just add, I think the technical assistance and the guidance that comes with kind of really getting into the weeds around questions we need answered around implementation. I think that's part of the challenge, and I think a little bit what Tim was talking about too, because I know we are trying to figure some of this out, but not having answers sometimes to these more detailed technical questions that districts might be raising for AIB or MSTE makes it challenging sometimes to really think through the best path or the best strategy for how to move forward on something. Whether it's the career pathways or, the early learning pieces. I mean, as we are trying to plan that out over the course of the next few years, sometimes what might seem like a very small technical question can be a challenge for us as we think through the planning, and having really clear guidance and answers to those questions from AIB and from MSDE would be really helpful for us as we go through the process of like developing and implementing our plans.
Right, thank you. Another objective on Pillar 5 has to do with the establish and deploy expert review teams. This has some clear things that we could measure but I don't know if they're the right things to measure. And there's just the number of schools that were visited. But there are procedures that are supposed to be, or products, or that basically best practices are supposed to be identified and shared. And so ideas about, so right now, the draft outcome measures are evidence-based recommendations tailored to the needs of school communities are provided by expert review teams to underperforming schools. Identification and dissemination of best practices from top performing schools based on expert review teams' findings. And use of data collected by expert review teams to inform MSDE's technical assistance strategy. I don't know how we're going to measure most of those, but I'd love to hear people's thoughts about sort of the expert review team process. What would make sense in terms of outcome measures to make sure it's happening the way it's targeted to be happening? The silence is death. Has anyone had an expert review team visit? Or been part of one?
So we've got a few folks who are in the pool of expert review team members for MSDE. I do think that based on what we've heard, it'll just be important to get their feedback as they go through this process. We know it's iterative. MSDE is doing this for the first time, but maybe establishing some sort of sharing. I'd be really interested to see what Dr. Collins and the other folks there think would be appropriate, since they're like so deep into the weeds on this. They've been really thoughtful, but I just don't know it all as well as they do.
Sounds like this would be a good topic to dig in further and then revisit also. Not to say that we can't continue talking about it, but it definitely needs some further research between meetings and discussions.
I think the other key from the expert review team piece is that the expectations of what people would be looking for when they're entering a building is also kind of helpful. And that's kind of, I know it's impossible to do when we're developing it at the same time, but like as an building administrator, I'm not going to want you to come into my building and like, I have no idea what you're really looking at, because I'd like to have an idea of that several years in advance as I'm thinking about how I'm planning my staff development, how I'm looking at my instructional walkthroughs, et cetera. And so like without having that, it's kind of a little like you don't really know what you're going to receive. You don't really know what you're getting yourself into. So more of that, I think, will look better in the coming years as it kind of starts to shape like what our look fors might be as we are working with schools. And then they would be able to provide meaningful input back on the feedback that they're receiving to then say like, yes, this was a helpful process, and have some of that. But I think in these initial years, that's going to be hard to gather, because you're not really you don't know what you're expecting, and then you don't know how to provide feedback on what you received because you didn't know you wanted it or that you were going to get it. And so there's going to be, that's going to take some time to actually have meaningful feedback after that process. And it's not going to look great in the first couple of years. And it might be more process oriented as opposed to like actual content oriented in the first few like iterations of this.
Rachel, I noticed you're unmuted. Was that from before, or did you want to say something?
It is from before, but
Okay.
actually, since you, I agree with Tim, and I think, it applies to a lot of the blueprint, actually, not just expert review teams, in terms of the iterative process, and, that, we're learning as we go, and that the first few years feel more process oriented than actual sort of content expectations. But when we get to the content expectations, I think, the ultimate goal for the expert review teams is to give us the school level sort of bird's eye view of blueprint implementation in action, and ultimately, whether at the school level, the policies and practices that are sort of at the macro level in the blueprint law and in the plan are actually, being implemented in the schools. And I think they're going to be incredibly valuable. And it's not just like the number of schools visited, but, the number of schools that are, I don't know how they're going to end up rating them, but, that get the highest rating on from an expert review team, or the number of schools that don't get a great rating on their first visit, but the follow-up visit is positive, or things like that. Those are the kind of outcomes I would be looking for.
I apologize for not knowing the answer to this, but is for those schools that are visited and found to not rate as highly as desired, automatically scheduled for a follow-up visit?
There are a series of, in the statute, a series of steps where the expert review team makes recommendations, and then those recommendations, the school has sort of an option to implement some of the recommendations and maybe not others of the recommendations. And then they're revisited. And if they're still not, if they haven't improved, then the recommendations are no longer optional. And that can include specifying what curriculum is used in different content areas. And ultimately a recommendation can be made to the AIB if the recommendations aren't being implemented, or to withhold money from that school.
Rachel Amstutz, did you want to share your thought, just so folks who are watching the live stream can hear your thought?
Sure. I was just thinking about, like, one of the outcomes of the visits, there would be recommendations, and they could run a whole gamut of things, but somehow if they could be tabulated or compiled, whether they're paired with a different principal in school in their district, or if curriculum is evaluated, or whatever one of those recommendations might be. First of all, just what types of those recommendations are made, and then in the long haul, whether or not they are implemented and deemed to be helpful, or something like that, to keep track of the process and see if that part is helping grow what we want to see grown in our schools.
Thank you. Are there any other comments that folks want to draw our attention to on Pillar 5? Or the many questions that were posed about how we're going to measure this stuff, which are all very good. So I encourage you to read them and think about how we would address those questions. Now we might yield back a few minutes of your day to you. All right, Emma, I'm going to hand this over to you to close out.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't really have too much left to discuss here, except to say that our next outcome measures work group meeting. I'll actually share my screen one last time so you can see here. But the next meeting is on Tuesday, May 9th from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. We will be getting back in touch with the content for that meeting. As we've talked about before, we're going to be going back through outcome measures discussions and continuing discussions for different pillars. So I think we're anticipating that this next meeting will be around pillars 1 and 2 again, but we will send out the agenda in advance and any requests for review in advance as well, and I can give you further details about the content of that meeting in the next week or two here. So we are really excited to continue these conversations. We still have a lot left to talk about. And I think that this was a really robust conversation today. So I just wanted to thank everyone. And again, if you have any feedback or anything, any additional outcome measures, please send them our way.
All right, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.